At 64 years old, after 4 decades in the workforce, I still woke up every morning with that nagging feeling that I needed to double-check something, a bill, a date, a random number. But on the afternoon I threw 47 pages of bank statements onto the kitchen island. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument I had ever faced in my entire life. My daughter and my son-in-law turned as white as a sheet of paper. Right there was everything they thought I would never find out, every late-night wire transfer, every sports bet, every lie disguised as a household expense, printed out in neat columns, irrefutable, with no way out. I didn't cry. I had finished crying weeks before, all by myself, behind a closed door, with no one watching. But before I continue, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and let me know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories reach. My name is Vivian. I'm 64, with silver hair. I stopped dyeing at 58 because I got tired of pretending time doesn't pass, and 3 decades of public service at the county clerk's office, a whole lifetime dealing with documents, signatures, public records, the official paperwork that organizes people's existence. I've been a widow for 12 years. My husband, Harrison, died of a massive heart attack on a Tuesday morning while I was at work. When my supervisor called me into her office and closed the door with that specific gentleness people only use when the news is devastating, I knew before she even opened her mouth. Life taught me early on that the hardest things arrive without warning, and what you do afterward is what defines who you are. After Harrison died, I learned to do everything myself. Not because I wanted to, because I had no choice. Paying the mortgage, dealing with plumbing emergencies, filing IRS tax returns, arguing with the HOA, buying homeowners insurance, raising a daughter. All alone, with my monthly spreadsheet open every Friday afternoon, a sharp pencil in hand, and the clear conscience of someone who knows exactly where every single dollar goes. My daughter, Natalie, is 32. She's beautiful, smart, funny when she wants to be, and capable when she needs to be, and that last part is the problem, because she rarely needs to be, having learned from a young age that her mother simply fixes things. Natalie moved back in with me 2 years ago, after her marriage with Spencer wasn't working out. Her words. I was never a fan of Spencer. He had that demeanor of a man utterly convinced the world owed him something just for existing, but Natalie loved him, or said she did. As a mother, I've learned there are battles not worth fighting because the only thing you'll achieve is becoming the villain of the story. So, I opened the doors of my 2-bedroom condo in Evanston to both of them, put fresh linens in the guest room, and told them they could stay until they got back on their feet. 2 years later, they were still getting back on their feet. The story I'm about to tell you started on a Thursday afternoon in October, as gray and ordinary as any other October Thursday in Illinois. I had left the clerk's office 40 minutes early to refill my blood pressure prescription, a monthly ritual so automatic I practically did it on autopilot. The pharmacy was 2 blocks from my condo. I knew Brittany, the pharmacist, by name, and she'd start typing in my refill before I even reached the counter. I waited 3 minutes, then swiped my debit card with the absolute certainty of someone who had done it hundreds of times. The card reader took a second longer than usual. Brittany looked at the screen, then looked at me with that specific smile, the smile of someone who has bad news and wishes they weren't the one delivering it. It declined. Ms. Vivian. Do you want to try inserting the chip? I tried. Declined. I tried a second time, with that irrational faith that repeating the exact same motion might somehow change the outcome. Declined again. I stood frozen at the counter for a moment that lasted much longer than it should have. My Social Security check had hit my account the week before. I knew this for a fact because I had checked it on Monday, as I did every month, and there was $2,800 in the account, clean, the usual amount. There was absolutely no reason for the card to decline. I paid for the medication with the cash I kept in my wallet, a habit I inherited from my mother, who always said a smart woman never relies solely on plastic, thanked Brittany, and walked out into the October chill with that brick in the stomach feeling you get when you know you have a problem but don't yet know the magnitude of it. I walked home slowly. My mind did what it always does when anxiety hits, listing reasonable explanations, starting with the most innocent. A glitch in the bank's network. A fraud alert freezing the card over a suspicious purchase. Some automatic auto-pay draft that had slipped my mind. The human mind searches for the reasonable before accepting the unthinkable, because the unthinkable hurts in a way you're never prepared for, even when you should be. I walked through my front door at 6:10. Natalie was lying on the sofa with her phone resting on her stomach, AirPods in, watching something with that vacant expression of someone who isn't entirely present. Spencer was in the kitchen, opening and closing cabinet doors like someone looking for a snack without knowing what they want. They both mumbled a generic greeting without looking up. I said hello back and walked straight to my bedroom. I opened my banking app. I had to put on my reading glasses because the first time I saw the numbers, I assumed I'd misread them. I put my glasses on, pulled the phone closer, and read it again, slowly, digit by digit. $43.17. $43.17. That was all that was left of my $2,800 pension, deposited just 6 days prior. I sat on the edge of the bed because my legs demanded it. I stared at the screen for an amount of time I can't even quantify. It could have been 2 minutes, it could have been 10. Then I started scrolling through the transaction history, line by line, and what I saw was like opening a box you know contains something terrible, but you open it anyway because keeping the lid shut doesn't change what's inside. There were Zelle transfers I hadn't made. To an account whose owner I didn't immediately recognize. $350 on a Tuesday, $200 on a Friday, $450 early on a Sunday morning while I was at church. There were charges from online sportsbook apps I had never downloaded. There were late-night DoorDash orders from expensive restaurants, delivered to my address, food I had never eaten because I was fast asleep while the two of them dined nicely on my dime. There were 6 monthly subscriptions to streaming platforms I didn't use, each one looking small on its own but adding up over 12 months to a figure that made me swallow hard. There were cash withdrawals from ATMs made in the dead of night, at 2:17 a.m., 3:04 a.m., 2:48 a.m., from machines in neighborhoods I never visit. Someone had been leaving the condo while I slept, or had my banking info on another device, and was pulling cash in the middle of the night like it was their own account. I sat in my room for almost an hour, phone in hand, scrolling up and down the statement. The anger I expected to feel didn't come right away. Instead, I felt a cold, crystal clear realization. A strange sensation that everything I had been feeling for the past few months, without being able to name it, was finally taking shape. That weird feeling when the budget didn't balance halfway through the month. The nagging sense that I was always paying more than I should be, without figuring out where it was going. The moments I'd look at my balance, get confused, assume I'd forgotten about a utility bill, and curse my own aging memory. I hadn't forgotten anything. Someone was taking it. I didn't go out and confront anyone that night. In 64 years of life, one of the most important things I've learned is that a confrontation without proof is just a screaming match, and a screaming match without proof solves nothing. It just gives the other person a chance to deny, to rewrite history, to flip the script. If I marched into the living room right then and said what I was thinking, in 20 minutes I'd be the one apologizing for distrusting my own daughter. No. I needed paper. I needed hard numbers, printed out, time-stamped, and official. I needed irrefutable proof. I went to sleep that night with a plan forming in my chest, solidifying with every hour I lay awake staring at the dark ceiling. On Friday morning, I called the clerk's office and took a personal day. I didn't explain why, I just said I had an unavoidable personal matter, which was more than true. I woke up at 6:30, got dressed meticulously in one of my tailored coats, and drank my coffee slower than usual, focusing on the taste as if I wanted to bottle that moment of normalcy before the storm hit. I arrived at the Chase branch at exactly 8 in the morning, right as the doors unlocked. There were 4 other people in line ahead of me. I waited with the specific patience of a woman who is furious but cannot yet show it. The branch manager who called me over was Diane, a woman in her 40s, bob haircut, wedding band, carrying that professional, slightly rushed demeanor of someone with too many clients and too little time. I told her I needed a detailed, printed statement of the last 12 months. Every month, every single transaction, with the maximum level of detail the system allowed. She typed something in, waited for the laser printer to do its job, and handed me a stack of paper so thick I had to take it with both hands. I thanked her, put it in my tote bag, and walked out. I got into my car. I turned on the heater. The crisp October air was hitting the windshield, but I needed a closed, quiet space. I put on my glasses, sorted the pages by month, and started reading from the oldest to the newest, armed with a red pen I'd bought the night before along with a manila folder. It took me 58 minutes. 58 minutes sitting in a bank parking lot, while the world kept spinning outside, cars driving by, a young mom pushing a stroller, an older man walking out of the branch looking satisfied that he'd run his errands. Ordinary life happening, while mine was being entirely rewritten on those pages with the blue alternating lines. The recipient of the Zelle transfers was Spencer Miller, my son-in-law's full name. The transfers started in November of the previous year. There were 11 months of history I was seeing for the very first time. 26 wire transfers over that period. The smallest was $150. The largest was $900, sent on a Friday at 2 p.m., when I was definitely at my desk at the county office and he was home, with access to the living room iPad where I had installed my banking app. I had never bothered to set up a secondary passcode on it, because it was my home, and I never imagined I'd need to protect myself from the people living inside it. I added it all up on my phone's calculator while I highlighted. The direct transfers to Spencer's account totaled $10,400. But that wasn't all. There were the sports books, 2 different betting apps, with regular, sometimes daily deposits, totaling $5,200 over 11 months. There were the DoorDash and Uber Eats charges I hadn't made, late-night premium burgers, sushi, artisanal pizza, $2 $400 in total. Food eaten in my own home by people I was supporting, while I slept entirely unaware. There were the streaming platforms, adding up to $1,800. And there were the late-night ATM runs, 12 withdrawals, all between midnight and 4 a.m., totaling $4,700. I added it all together. I double-checked the math 3 times because the final number didn't feel real. $24,500. $24,500. In 11 months. Drained from the retirement funds of a woman who had spent her entire life being frugal, saving whatever she could, and never living beyond her means. I folded the papers with deliberate care. Each crease was an act of restraint, a way to keep myself from exploding right there in the driver's seat. I placed them inside the manila folder. On the cover, I wrote in black Sharpie, "Statements, personal." I put it back in my bag, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot knowing I would never be the same woman who had driven in. That afternoon, I spent 2 hours locked in my bedroom, the statements spread across my quilt, for different colored highlighters in my hand. Orange for the direct transfers to Spencer. Blue for the sports books. Green for the unauthorized subscriptions. Pink for the late-night ATM withdrawals. When I finished, the 47 pages looked like an FBI evidence file, color-coded, organized, every piece of theft identified and categorized. I hid the folder at the back of my closet, tucked behind 3 shoeboxes against the wall that absolutely no one touches but me. I placed it in a very specific way, with the flap facing up, so I would know instantly if anyone had snooped. Then I walked out of my bedroom, went to the kitchen, heated up some leftover soup, and ate dinner alone at the island while listening to the 2 of them giggling at a TikTok video in the living room. My facial expression never shifted. My tone of voice never changed. I said goodnight when I went to bed. I politely said, "No, thank you," when Natalie asked if I wanted a cookie. I operated as a highly trained, autopilot version of myself, while internally, brick by brick, I was building exactly what I was going to do next. The first step was opening a new account. The following Monday, I went back to Chase. Same branch, same Diane. This time, I asked to open an individual checking account, solely in my name, linked only to my social security number, with exclusive access granted only to my personal iPhone, locking out any other authorized devices. I also submitted the paperwork to reroute my pension direct deposit to this new routing number. Diane didn't ask a single question beyond what was legally required for the paperwork. There was something in the way she worked, fast, precise, without unnecessary small talk, that told me she had seen this exact scenario play out before. An older woman coming in alone to open a lockdown, individual account always has a story, and anyone who's worked in banking long enough learns to spot it without asking. When I left, I had a temporary debit card and a firm date. My next check would drop into the new account. No one else would have access to that money but me. The days that followed were the longest of my adult life, and believe me, I've lived through my fair share of hard times. Losing Harrison suddenly was agonizing. Raising Natalie as a single mother from age 42 onward was exhausting. Battling thyroid cancer at 55, going through surgery and radiation without missing a week of work because I desperately needed the health insurance, was grueling. But those days of waiting carried a very specific, suffocating weight. It was the burden of knowing everything but having to stay dead silent. Of living under the same roof as the people robbing me blind. Of keeping up the facade of mom on the surface, while carrying the crushing reality of their betrayal underneath. I woke up, brewed coffee, asked how they slept, cooked Sunday pot roast, and watched the evening news. And I observed. I started noticing things I used to brush off. The way Spencer checked his phone with a frantic urgency that totally contradicted his otherwise lazy demeanor. The hushed whispers that abruptly stopped the second I walked into the hallway. The fact that the living room iPad, which I had practically gifted them when they moved in, was always placed face down on the coffee table whenever I walked by. Natalie actually tried to ask me for money on Wednesday, as casually as always, acting as if asking was the most natural thing in the world and a yes was guaranteed. She said she needed some cash for a Trader Joe's run. I looked her in the eye and said money was just a little tight right now. She furrowed her brow, that expression of genuine shock from someone who had literally never been told no, and I looked away, offering zero explanation. She hovered for a second, then walked off. She didn't push it. Natalie never had to push, because she'd never had to fight for a yes. Spencer left the house every day at 10 a.m., claiming he was running some errands. He'd come back around 4 or 5, usually empty-handed, and his answers about his day were always incredibly vague, fine, normal, you know, stuff, filler words designed to reveal absolutely nothing. I had stopped interrogating him months before any of this started, but now I paid attention to the exact rattle of his keys when he unlocked the front door. On the 9th day of waiting, my pension cleared. I opened the new banking app, the one that only lived on my phone, behind my Face ID, and there it was, $2,800, clean, whole, entirely mine. Then I opened the app for the old, compromised account. The balance was $0. Absolute zero. I had set up SMS text alerts for any attempted transactions, and the night before, I had received a ping, transfer attempt declined due to insufficient funds. Someone had tried to dip their hand in the cookie jar, and they hit the bottom. I sat on the edge of my mattress holding both phones, one showing safety and the other showing a flat zero, and I felt something settle deep in my chest. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't satisfaction, it was a profound sense of grounding. The feeling of finally standing on solid earth after wandering through a swamp in the dark. I went to the closet and grabbed the manila folder. I dropped the folder onto the living room coffee table with a heavy, dry thud that echoed through the condo. It was a quiet moment. Natalie was scrolling on her phone, and Spencer was half asleep on the couch with the TV muted. They both stared at the folder. Then they stared at me. There was no rage on my face. I had literally practiced this in the bathroom mirror that afternoon. Neutral expression. Level voice. Not because I wasn't furious, I was livid, but because visible anger gives the other person the illusion that they have power over your emotions. And I was completely done handing out my power. Sit up, I said. They sat up. Spencer adopted that casual slouch that is actually a hyper-defensive posture, leaning back, arms loosely crossed, chin tilted up. Natalie folded her hands in her lap, her face already shifting. It was as if some primal instinct in her knew, before I even spoke a word, that the reckoning had arrived. I opened the folder. I pulled out the first page, the statement from last November, the month the bleeding started, and slid it across the glass table toward them in dead silence. Then the second page. The third. I laid them out one by one, methodically, the harsh whisper of the heavy paper filling the dead air of the living room like a soundtrack nobody asked for. There were 47 pages. It took time. Neither of them made a sound, but their faces told the whole story. Natalie's flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson before draining into a sickly, nauseous pale. Spencer's face went completely rigid, locking his jaw, the visible strain of a man trying to calculate his escape route while his brain was still processing the ambush. When the final page hit the glass, I spoke. I gave them the grand total. $24,500 over 11 months. Drained from my retirement, from the joint checking account I had naively left logged in because I never fathomed I would need a firewall inside my own sanctuary. I told them the numbers came directly from the bank's mainframe, printed by the branch manager, complete with timestamps and IP logs. I told them I had color-coded it by category, and that if they wanted, we could go through it line by line, and that I was going to do exactly that anyway, whether they liked it or not. Natalie broke first, just like I knew she would. She always cracked first. She immediately started weaving context, how Spencer had been laid off for so long, how the bills were suffocating them, how she was terrified of stressing me out, how it was only a temporary bridge loan, how they were going to pay back every single cent the second he landed a job. Her voice trembled. The tears welled up. She frantically built a narrative of victimhood that tried to make federal wire fraud sound like an unavoidable family misunderstanding. I let her finish. I listened to every excuse, every justification, every dramatic pause. I've learned over decades of dealing with people that if you interrupt a liar, you lose the thread. I couldn't afford to lose the thread tonight. When she finally ran out of breath, I asked her one question. Just one. Why didn't you just ask me? Silence. I have said yes to absolutely everything you have ever asked of me, Natalie. I co-signed your apartment lease without blinking. I locked away your grandmother's jewelry when you moved out. I opened my home to you when your marriage hit the rocks. I bought your furniture, I paid for your transmission repair, I fronted your electric bills when you were broke. Every single time you looked me in the eye and asked for help, I said yes. So why, this time, couldn't you just ask? Spencer was the one who answered. He mumbled that they knew I was going to say no. That answer hung in the air for a very long time. None of the three of us moved a muscle. Outside, a CTA bus hissed past. The refrigerator kicked on. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked past 8:30, a sound I usually tune out completely. They knew I was going to say no, so they simply made the decision for me. Month after month, while I drove to the county office at 8 a.m., spent 8 hours filing bureaucratic paperwork, came home exhausted at 6 p.m., cooked, cleaned, went to sleep, and woke up to do it all over again, they just took it. They didn't ask. They didn't warn me. They didn't leave an IOU on the fridge. They took it with the entitlement of scavengers, burying it in silence because thieves know their actions cannot survive the light of day. I spent the next 2 hours going page by page. For every Zelle transfer flagged with Spencer's name, I demanded an answer. For every DraftKings deposit, a question. For every 3 a.m. ATM run, a question. Some got pathetic excuses. Many got completely dodged with vague deflections. Some were met with a silence that was a loud enough answer on its own. And then there was the other name on the wire logs, a totally separate account, to which $3,800 had been funneled in 4 transactions. When I pointed to it, Spencer's eyes darted away, and I watched Natalie catch him doing it. In that specific fraction of a second, something shattered between the two of them that I knew was never going to be glued back together. It wasn't explosive. Nobody screamed, nobody threw a lamp. It was just her terrified realization, his cowardly flinch, and the devastating silence that followed. When I was done, I gathered the papers, squared them up, slid them back into the manila folder, and announced that tomorrow we would discuss the consequences. Tonight was strictly for swallowing the reality of the math. There was no debate to be had, the numbers had already spoken. I walked to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of my bed. Through the drywall, I could hear their voices. Natalie's was a frantic, hushed whisper of a woman trying to piece together a puzzle that had missing pieces. Spencer's was clipped, defensive, and short. Then, dead silence. Then, the sound of their bedroom door slamming shut. At 2 a.m., I was still wide awake, and that was when the tears finally came. It wasn't the hot tears of rage, I had weaponized that. This was a profound, gut-wrenching grief. The kind of sobbing that hits when you are forced to look at reality exactly as it is, rather than how you desperately wished it could be. I cried into my pillow for 20 minutes, alone, in the dark. Then I wiped my face, drank a glass of water, lay back down, and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion finally took me. Saturday morning, I was up before the sun. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen island with the black leather notebook I use for important things, and drafted exactly what I was going to say, in bullet points, leaving zero room for misinterpretation. I wrote for 40 minutes. I crossed out the purely vindictive thoughts, kept the boundaries of self-preservation, and edited it until it was razor sharp. When Natalie shuffled out at 9 a.m., and Spencer dragged himself out 10 minutes later, both looking like they'd slept in a war zone, I was ready. Not like a woman ready for a bar fight. Like a woman ready for a board meeting that was years overdue. I told them I wasn't calling the cops. Not because I didn't have a slam-dunk felony case, I did, and they knew it. But because I was 64, managing high blood pressure, and I absolutely refused to spend the twilight of my life dragging myself through police precincts and county courthouses over 2 adults who had already cost me enough. What I wanted was simple: my life back, my peace of mind, and an iron vault around my assets. There were 3 non-negotiable conditions. Condition 1, Spencer had 30 days to secure a W-2 job. Not his dream career, not a gig that aligned with his passions, any legal, taxable paycheck. In 30 days, if he wasn't bringing in actual income, he had to pack his bags and vacate the premises. It wasn't a punishment, it was the logical, real-world consequence for a 34-year-old man who refuses to pull his weight and resorts to theft to mask his laziness. Condition 2, Natalie could continue living under my roof, provided she paid $800 a month in rent and utilities, her fair share of the HOA, electric, water, and Wi-Fi. She also had to buy her own groceries, entirely separate from mine. I knew she was making barely minimum wage at her part-time retail job, but $800 was drastically below market rate for Chicago suburbs, and she knew it. Condition 3, neither of them would ever have access to any device, router, or account in my name ever again. The living room iPad had been factory reset and passcode locked that morning. My old debit card was shredded. The new checking account was Fort Knox. Spencer reacted exactly as predicted, with immediate pushback, gaslighting, and the audacity to claim 30 days was an unrealistic timeline in this economy, that the job market was brutal, that I was out of touch with how the world works now. I let him dig his hole. When he finished, I lowered my voice to a terrifying calm and told him I had worked for 40 years on a fixed government salary. I raised a child on a single income after becoming a widow at 52. I paid off a mortgage, covered college tuition, and survived cancer treatments without taking a dime of charity. I knew exactly what financial hardship looked like. What I refused to accept was the delusion that being broke gives you a license to embezzle from your own mother-in-law. That wasn't a circumstance, it was a malicious choice. Natalie sat completely mute for almost the entire lecture. There was a shift in her posture, an emotion I couldn't quite pinpoint. It looked like a cocktail of profound shame mixed with the dawn of a harsh reality check that was arriving a decade late, but arriving nonetheless. When Spencer stormed away from the kitchen island with the scowl of a defeated man, she stayed seated. She looked at me in a way she hadn't in years. It was the exact look of a little girl who broke a vase, knew she was caught, but was terrified her mother was going to stop loving her. I told her I loved her. I told her I had always loved her, and I always would. And that it was precisely because I loved her that I was dropping the hammer. Because a mother who allows herself to be bled dry until there's nothing left isn't loving anyone, she's just becoming a martyr. I told her that cutting off the parasite that was destroying me wasn't a lack of love. It was the only way I could survive to keep loving her. She wept. And it wasn't the manipulative, theatrical crying I had dealt with during her teenage years. This was different. Quiet. Deep. Coming from the dark place where we bury the truths we despise about ourselves. The kind of crying that only happens when you stop playing the victim and finally look in the mirror. The 30-day clock started that Saturday. I went to my sewing room, a tiny converted closet with my Singer machine and fabrics, where I go to find peace, and I sewed in absolute silence for 2 hours while the condo remained dead quiet around me. On the 12th afternoon of the countdown, the mail carrier rang the buzzer. I was home because a migraine had forced me to leave work early. I signed for the certified mail without checking the return address, just muscle memory for official envelopes. When I finally glanced at it, the sender was a predatory online lending company I had never heard of. I ripped it open right there in the entryway, still wearing my boots. Inside was a finalized contract for an unsecured personal loan. $35,000, spread over 36 brutal months of interest. Date of electronic signature, 4 months ago. Status, 3 payments past due. The letter was a final notice of default, meaning my pristine credit score was about to be nuked by a collections agency over a debt I didn't even know existed. The electronic signature on the final page mimicked my handwriting. Someone had practiced it. The capital V was close, but the loop on the N slanted in a way my hand simply didn't move. I stared at that forgery for an eternity, trying to wrap my mind around the sheer sociopathy required for a man who ate my eggs every morning to commit felony identity fraud in my name. I collapsed onto the entryway bench. The migraine went from a dull ache to a blinding spike. I sat there just regulating my breathing before I reached for my phone. I called the lender's fraud department. The representative verified the contract, verified my social security number, confirmed it was entirely in my name, and stated it had passed full digital validation. I demanded to know what phone number the 2FA confirmation text was sent to. She cited privacy laws, refusing to give it to me over the phone, but advised I file a formal dispute with my ID and utility bills. I hung up and immediately dialed my lawyer, a close friend of 30 years who I had given a heads up to a few weeks prior. I read her the letter. She listened in silence while I furiously took notes. What she outlined was catastrophic. Identity theft. Wire fraud. Forgery of financial instruments. Combined with the massive dollar amount, we were looking at federal crimes carrying real prison time. She ordered me to file a police report immediately. Even if I didn't want to see Spencer behind bars, the report shielded me from liability, created an airtight paper trail, and gave me the legal ammunition required to force the lender to void the fraudulent loan and scrub my credit report. That evening, when Spencer dragged himself back from another exhausting day of networking, I summoned them both to the living room. I slammed the default notice onto the glass table. Natalie read it. Spencer read it. The blood drained from both their faces in very different ways, hers in absolute, horrified shock, his in the sickening, pale panic of a cornered rat. I told them it was a felony. I said it slowly, enunciating every syllable. Not as a screaming threat, but as a cold legal fact. I told them I had retained counsel, that I understood the exact mandatory minimums for identity theft, and that I held 2 cards in my hand: file the police report and press charges, or let him walk. I told him I hadn't decided if he was going to jail yet, but the 30-day eviction notice was officially void. You have until Friday, I told Spencer. 5 days. Get out of my house. He tried to spin it. He babbled about desperation, how he was going to hit a parley and pay it off before I ever noticed, how he never meant for it to hit collections. The words spilled out of his mouth at a frantic pace, the desperate pitch of a con man whose silver tongue had finally hit a brick wall. I didn't say another word. I picked up the letter, walked into my bedroom, booted up my desktop, and filed formal complaints with the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Illinois Attorney General, attaching every scrap of evidence I had collected, exactly as my lawyer instructed. Then, I drove to the precinct and filed the police report. Natalie stayed locked in her bedroom all night. Around 10 p.m., I heard her sobbing through the wall. I walked into the hallway and stood outside her door for a long time. I didn't knock. I didn't open it. There is a very thin, brutal line between the grace you extend to your child and the respect you must demand for yourself, and I could not cross it that night. I went back to bed, read a thriller novel for an hour, turned off the lamp, and closed my eyes. Spencer packed up on Thursday. 1 day before the deadline. It proved he still possessed a shred of self-preservation. Better to flee on his own terms than be physically dragged out by the sheriff's department. I woke up at 6 a.m., and his duffel bags were already lined up in the hallway. I went to the kitchen to start the coffee maker. He was standing there, chugging a glass of water, lingering with the pathetic posture of a man waiting for a dramatic goodbye. I offered him nothing. I poured water into the reservoir, grabbed my favorite mug, and ignored him. He grabbed his backpack, hoisted his rolling suitcase, opened the front door, and walked out. The deadbolt clicked shut behind him. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, the coffee grounds in my hand, listening to the elevator descend, and listening to the profound, glorious silence that replaced him. I brewed my coffee. I drank it slowly. Natalie didn't emerge until almost 11 a.m. Her eyes were swollen shut and her hair was a mess. We sat at the kitchen island for a long time without speaking. Finally, with the trembling voice of someone weighing every syllable before it left her throat, she spoke. I knew about some of it. Not the loan. Not the other woman's account. But I knew about the cash, and I looked the other way because I was terrified of being alone. I didn't rush to comfort her. I let the confession hang in the air. I know, I said. And I did. There is a massive legal difference between what Spencer did behind her back and what he did right in front of her. But the things she chose to ignore were still choices, and cowardice has a price. We didn't have a cinematic, tear-jerking breakthrough that day. We shared a heavy silence, hot coffee, and an unspoken agreement that the future was going to be radically different. She retreated to her room for the rest of the day. I went to my sewing machine, put on a jazz radio station on low, and spent hours finishing a quilt I had abandoned months ago because I had always been too busy putting out everyone else's fires. In the first few days after he left, the condo shifted in subtle, incredible ways. The air felt lighter. My groceries stayed in the fridge. My bills arrived, I looked at the totals, and the math actually made sense. The suffocating quicksand was gone, replaced by solid concrete. I went to war with the loan company. Armed with my lawyer, the police report, and the IP logs proving the electronic signature was executed from Natalie's iPad, I relentlessly escalated the fraud claim. It took 4 grueling months. 4 months of red tape, notarized affidavits, hold music, and fighting tooth and nail. But in the end, the $35,000 loan was completely discharged. My credit report was scrubbed clean. The lender was legally forced to delete the collections account. I didn't press criminal charges. I made that choice one morning when I realized that every time I pictured the subpoenas, the depositions, and years of dragging myself to the courthouse, my soul felt exhausted. I had spent 64 years building a beautiful life. I refused to spend my remaining years trying to destroy someone else's, even if he deserved it. But the police report stayed on file. Stamped, categorized, and sitting in a database. A loaded gun left on the table, just in case he ever tried to return. It has been exactly 12 months since that afternoon at the pharmacy. This morning, I woke up at 6:30 without an alarm, just like always. I brewed a dark roast, stirred in 2 sugars, and used the vintage kettle I inherited from my mother. It makes me feel like she's keeping watch. I took my mug out to the balcony, sat in the wicker chair I've owned for 15 years, and watched Evanston wake up. The corner bodega rolling up its awning. The guy from 5B walking his golden retriever. A pair of pigeons fighting over a bagel crust on the fire escape across the street. The sky was a sharp, biting October blue, completely cloudless and brilliantly clear. I sat out there for 40 minutes. I didn't do anything but sip my coffee and watch the street. And I thought about how expensive that simple freedom was, the right to sit on your own balcony, drink your own coffee, and breathe your own air without constantly calculating, guarding, or bracing for impact. I didn't realize how heavy the toll was until the exact second I stopped paying it. My new savings account is sitting at $24,200. Built from scratch in 12 months. I didn't starve myself, I didn't clip coupons obsessively, I just lived within my means, exactly as I had done before I invited a parasite into my home. It's the largest emergency fund I've had since Harrison was alive. That fact alone proves how deeply I had normalized living in everyone else's red ink, at the cost of my own black. Natalie has been working full-time since May. She got a job at a mid-sized accounting firm, started as a clerk, and just got promoted to a junior associate role. She's taking evening classes. She hasn't officially told me what for, but I saw the CPA certification prep books on the kitchen counter, and I pretended not to notice because it's her goal, and she'll share it when she's ready. She pays me $800 on the first of the month, buys her own groceries, and splits the Wi-Fi bill with a pride that never existed before. Turns out, responsibility makes a lot more sense when you're actually forced to shoulder it. They are small victories. But real change always lives in the small things, not the grand apologies. We did have one final conversation, about 3 weeks after Spencer was exiled. It was a talk I had unknowingly avoided for a decade. We sat on the couch around midnight, the condo perfectly still, and finally said the quiet parts out loud. About how I had coddled her entire life because saying no caused me too much anxiety. About how my fear of being the bad cop taught her that she never had to rescue herself. We realized that our dynamic was toxic. I was slowly erasing myself, and she was emotionally stunted, entirely dependent on a safety net that was fraying. It was a brutal conversation. Natalie cried a lot. I cried a little. There was no magical movie ending where everything is perfectly resolved. Just two women being more honest with each other than they had been in 30 years, and the mutual understanding that the honesty, while late, could still save us. As for Spencer, he vanished. I heard through the grapevine that he fled back to his parents' basement out of state. I don't care what he's doing. I don't harbor rage, I don't miss him, I feel absolutely nothing, and when it comes to toxic people, nothing is the greatest gift you can ask for. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic. It's just the overwhelming silence where the chaos used to be. If I had to summarize what I learned this year, looking out from my balcony with a hot coffee in hand, it boils down to this: setting boundaries is not a selfish act. Saying no is not abandonment. Proof matters, not because you should live a life of paranoia, but because when you finally stand up to the wolves, you need a mountain of evidence to stand on, and those 47 pages were my mountain. I learned that 64 is not too old to burn it all down and start over. It is never too late to look at the people taking advantage of you and say, enough. But most importantly, I learned that family is not a magic shield that protects you from accountability. Family is a daily series of choices made out of mutual respect and honesty. And when someone stops making those choices, DNA is not an excuse to let them destroy your life. That afternoon, a year ago, when I threw the manila folder onto the glass table, I had no idea what was going to happen. I didn't know if my daughter would turn on me. I didn't know if my heart would give out. All I knew was that I refused to be the victim anymore, the ATM, the silent martyr, the woman who confused being a doormat with being a good mother. That version of me was too expensive. And I have way too much life left to live to keep paying the bill. My second cup of coffee went cold while I was watching the pigeons on the fire escape. I didn't care. I have more in the pot, and all the time in the world to drink it. The morning is bright, the city is loud, and the home behind me is quiet, safe, and entirely mine. That is enough. Honestly? That is more than enough. Now, if you enjoyed this story, click subscribe, and tell me in the comments, which part made your jaw drop the most? Was it the ATM runs, or the forged loan? Oh, and don't forget to hit the join button to become a channel member for access to exclusive videos I don't post here. See you in the next one.